Here in part 6, we discover that humans are altering the nitrogen cycle. We alter the nitrogen cycle in one fundamental way. We add fertilizer. Modern fertilizers came about in the 1920s and accelerated after the end of the Second World War in 1945. Nitrogen is relatively cheap, and so the philosophy has been add more nitrogen to the farming field because you get a slightly increased yield. Small increases in yield result in more money. The result of that is that the amount of nitrogen that we add today via agriculture exceeds all of the natural inputs that you can find on Earth. So most of the nitrogen added to the atmosphere today comes from nitrogen fixation, and most of the nitrogen that ends up being as a pollutant comes as a result of nitrogen fertilizer running off from the fields into the rivers and eventually making its way to the ocean. So algal and cyanobacteria blooms are caused by eutrophication. Eutrophication is a term to describe excess nutrients that are in the waterways. So fertilizer runoff from agriculture is a very common process. So we add ammonia as fertilizer to the field. The crops use that ammonia to build proteins. Soil-dwelling bacteria and archaea use it as an electron donor, but so much more is added that it makes its way into the groundwaters and the rivers. This nitrate and ammonia, which has now entered into the marine and lake systems, results in a proliferation of algae and cyanobacteria. As those materials decompose, we find ourselves in a low oxygen environment, an anaerobic environment. These are known as dead zones. So we see the consequences of this excess fertilizer in two ways. One, we see an algal bloom, and the second, we see a dead zone. Perhaps the most famous dead zone in North America today is the Gulf area outside of the Mississippi River, where for hundreds of miles we have high nitrogen concentrations, and in the immediate vicinity, the first 100 miles of the outlet of the Mississippi, we essentially have anaerobic layers because of excess activity decreasing oxygen concentrations. We find these dead zones and these algal blooms even here in Utah. If you look in the news, you'll see that in Utah Lake, time after time, we're told stay away from certain areas. And now the Jordan River coming through the Salt Lake Valley and many of our lakes in the mountains have algal blooms. These algal blooms, these are simply pictures that people have taken from Utah Lake, are the result of excess fertilizer coming in from two sources. The first source is agriculture. The second source, which is really quite an important one in Utah Valley, is septic systems. That the septic systems and sewer systems in Utah County and in Salt Lake County are leaky. And the result of that is an increased nitrogen level into our waterways, into our groundwaters. The same is true up in Cache County, where we have heavy agriculture associated with activities in that part of the world. It's hard to tame these algal blooms. They're really cyanobacteria, not algae, because much of this nitrogen has gotten into the groundwater, and it will take years to decades to remove it from the groundwater system. It's our beloved cyanobacteria. But it has consequences. They produce toxic compounds, and in these toxic blooms from the cyanobacteria, we find a number of cyanotoxins. There's anotoxin that causes brain issues. And then there are other toxins that are associated with liver and kidney issues. So these toxins are not beneficial, but actually induce a harm into humans and pets if the water is swallowed. So we should be doing our best to try to reduce these inputs and reduce the algal blooms. That is, to reduce the cyanobacteria blooms. So for the group discussion today, we'll be talking about what do you think can be done to reduce these algal blooms, suggesting 3 ways in which we can reduce the intensity of these blooms. The Earth's biosphere contains a fixed amount of carbon and nitrogen. This carbon and nitrogen cycles through the environment and is reused by different organisms. It's important to recognize that today human activities are profoundly affecting both cycles in virtually all parts of the world.